for what is sure to be a really exciting and engaging talk. I'm Laura Igo. I'm Chief Curator here at the Michener, and I will be providing an introduction today. So to celebrate our 35th anniversary this year, we wanted to celebrate artists who are important to the Michener and to our history through a series of lectures happening this spring and then also this fall, and stay tuned for what's coming up after this summer. Last month, Liz Sheehan discussed the work of Catherine Renninger, and today I'm honored to introduce Mira Nakashima, who created one of the most iconic and beloved spaces in our museum. Mira Nakashima was born in Seattle, Washington in 1942. She was incarcerated in an internment camp in Idaho during World War II, but grew up in New Hope, Pennsylvania, where her father, George Nakashima, built his home and studio, and you can see a photo of him up on the screen. Mira earned her Bachelor of Arts in Architectural Sciences and General Studies at Harvard University, and then went on to complete a Master's in Architecture at Waseda University in Tokyo, Japan. After raising a family in Pittsburgh, she returned to Nakashima Studio in 1970 and apprenticed to her father until his passing in 1990, when Mira became creative director. Mira has supported exhibitions of her father's work and widely exhibited her own designs across the country and the world. She has also curated exhibitions, including, in 2019, Nakashima Looks at the Michener. She published Nature, Form, and Spirit, The Life and Legacy of George Nakashima in 2003, and this year published Process Book, described as an intimate window into how and why Nakashima Woodworkers operates as it does. She received a gold medal for excellence in the decorative arts from the National Arts Club in New York in 2008. Mira has continued her father's dream to construct peace altars for each of the continents of the world. The first one was installed at New York's Cathedral of St. John the Divine in 1986, and a second one was built for the 50th anniversary of the United Nations in 1995 and installed at the Russian Academy of Art in 2001. A third one was built, dedicated, and sent to Auroville, India in 1996, and a fourth one is in search of a new home on another continent. In 2014, the Nakashima property was designated a National Historic Landmark, as well as nominated to the World Monuments Fund list, which gratefully generates grants for reconstruction of some of the buildings. Mira has extended the tradition of Nakashima woodworkers by producing and reviving George's classic lines of furniture and continuing the evolution of new design solutions. Mira's designs, named Keisho, or continuation in Japanese, means preserving the methods and techniques embraced by her father and working from the same woodpile. She and Nakashima woodworkers are still guided by George's belief that, quote, "A tree is perhaps our most intimate contact with nature. Each tree, each part of a tree, has its own particular destiny, its own special yearning to be fulfilled." Please join me in welcoming Mira.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you all for sacrificing your wonderful afternoon to be with me this afternoon. It's nice to see all of you, and I hope that we shut down during COVID, of course, and that we are just opening up to tours this year, and we decided to limit the number of people just so COVID doesn't raise its ugly head again. And our tours are sold out for the year, unfortunately. But my grandson Toshi here is helping out with some of the tours on Saturdays, and my husband John is here. He's still working in the shop after almost 50 years. So I just wanted to thank the Michener Museum for being part of our very strong support system. I just asked Laura, I said, when did the Michener Museum open? Because it seems to me one of the very first shows you had was the retrospective of George Nakashima, and that was in the old Silverman Pavilion before all this new structure was built. And it was very significant that my father had his show back in Bucks County, and then it traveled around in New York and Los Angeles, and finally came home just before he passed away in 1990. But one of its venues, a very important venue here at the Michener Museum, and we're very grateful for that support. They also had a show of what was Nakashima and the Modernist Moment, which compared put Nakashima furniture in the context of his contemporaries in Europe, which was very interesting. That there were similar kinds of influences, but different kinds of work that came out in the middle of the 20th century. And then it's nice to still be here. Thank you. This is a picture of my father, maybe in the 1980s, sitting in front of his arts building. And in the background there, you may notice that there is a mosaic on the wall, and that's done by one of my father's very dear friends, Ben Shawn, the artist, lived in Hightstown. They became friends in the 1960s. Dad built, furniture for him, but he also built a second story on his very basic sort of one-story concrete block building, and I think it's probably the only two-story building in Roosevelt, New Jersey. It's in disrepair right now, unfortunately, but he and Dad were very good friends. They used to commiserate about the state of modern art and modern architecture in the 20th century. And they also had this commonality of having come from, as refugees to the United States. Ben's heritage was Russian Jewish, and of course they were persecuted in Europe. And Dad's ancestors came from Japan, and we were not quite as violently persecuted, but we were persecuted during World War II. So I think they had a lot of conversations about social justice and things like that, as well as commiserations about the state of modern art in the USA. So anyway, so Dad decided that Ben needed a gallery to display his work, and he built this. It's a hyperbolic paraboloid shell. It was built in 1967, and unfortunately, Ben passed away in 1969, so he didn't have this to use as his gallery very long. He had made a maquette of that mosaic when the building was under construction. He says, "Oh, George, that's a perfect wall to put a mosaic on." And he designed a mosaic, a maquette for that wall. And so my brother and my father took the maquette to Chartres, France, and had the mosaic realized in full scale and shipped over in 8 pieces. It was installed in 1971 as a monument to Dad's friendship with Ben Shawn. Now, jumping back in time, my father he was born in Spokane, Washington, and grew up in Seattle. It was I recently received a report from a fellow named Ron Ketcherside, who had done some research in the archives of the Boy Scouts of America, and actually traced the paths that my father had hiked in the Pacific Northwest when he was a young man. And he loved the woods and the trees so much that he majored in forestry at University of Washington for 2 years before he switched to architecture. And then he did so well in architecture, he got a scholarship to Harvard University and also to the École des Beaux-Arts in Fontainebleau outside of Paris. So Dad had these adventures, and when he graduated from MIT, oh, that's right, he went to Harvard for 2 weeks, and then he decided he didn't like it, and so he switched to MIT, and that was mostly because Harvard was into Bauhaus design theory, and MIT was much more grounded in building and in structural engineering. Some of you were smiling. But anyway, he graduated in 1930, had a few odd jobs, most of them mural painting, in the early 1930s, and then he had trouble earning a living, so he decided to sell his car and buy a steamship ticket around the world. And he ended up back in Paris, bummed around Paris for a while, and then he was fortunate because he got to see the great cathedrals in the area, and he saw a Corbusier building under construction. It was the Pavillon Suisse. and it was the first time he'd seen reinforced concrete being built, and it was pretty exciting. And I think he learned a lot just by observation. But anyway, he at one point decided that Paris in the 1930s was was indicative of the end of the Western world, and so he decided he'd better go back to the land of his ancestors in Tokyo. And so he stayed. That must have been like culture shock, going from Paris in the 1930s to his ancestral home outside of Tokyo, where they still lived in a traditional Japanese house with no central heat. And it was a beautiful old farmhouse, but with lots of wood and natural materials. But it, there was no central heat. There was, it was a whole different life. Probably stepping back a couple centuries in culture. And then his father contacted him and said, I think it's about time he got a real job. So this is a picture of his first real job. He's with Anton and Raymond, Anton and Noemi Raymond, in their Tokyo office in 1934. One of his best friends two of his best friends are in the front row there. The man on the left is Kunio Mayakawa. Maybe some of you have heard of him. He's a very was a prominent architect. And the man on the other side in the right-hand corner is Junzo Yoshimura, he was my dad's best friend in the Raymond office, and took him around to see a lot of the traditional Japanese architecture, which he learned a lot from in the 1930s. And then he was sent to, I don't know if I remember to keep this in or not, he was sent to India to work on the first reinforced concrete building in Pondicherry, India, and it changed his life. He said he was searching for a meaning for life, and he found it at the Sri Aurobindo ashram. He was not just architect on site, but he was general manager, and it was a tremendous learning experience, because first of all, nobody knew how to do reinforced concrete in India, and second of all, there weren't any materials to do it with. Not only were there no manpower that knew what to do with reinforced concrete, but there was no materials either, so they had to be imported, and all the crew who were local people had to be trained to do the concrete work. I don't remember if I kept a picture of that in the slideshow or not, but anyway. He thought he was going to stay there for the rest of his life, and took on the name Sundarananda, he who delights in beauty, and he thought he was going to stay at that ashram for the rest of his life. But the war started to break out, and all of his family was back here in the US, so he got on a boat and came back by way of Tokyo. Just happened to meet my mother in Tokyo, who was on her way back from visiting one sister in Australia and visiting her other sister in Tokyo, and was on her way back to Los Angeles, where she had lived before. And anyway, they were introduced and fell in love, were engaged, and eventually got married. That's the wedding picture on the left-hand side of the screen. Probably the only time that my mother wore a traditional kimono, and then shortly after that, a year later, I was born, and we were put into the camps on the Idaho desert. So the right-hand pictures are pictures of my dad working in a little workshop in the Camp Minidoka, and the person in the middle is Gentaro Hikogawa, who was a trained Japanese master carpenter, and he also was incarcerated during the war. But he and my father were tasked with trying to make our living spaces more livable. That meant, sealing up the cracks. My aunt, Thelma, and her father, my mother's father also, came with us. And what happened is that we knew we were all going to be incarcerated, all of those of us who were living along the West Coast. And we decided if we're going to be put into this camp, at least we would be together. So my mother's relatives and my dad's relatives, and we all went to the same camp in Minidoka, and that was some comfort. But Dad's learning experience was tremendous. He was just so happy to be working alongside this master carpenter. they had to use found materials. There weren't any really good lumber to work with. They used old packing crates and old leftover construction timbers. And I should have made this picture a little bit bigger, but Gentaro is there concentrating on this freeform piece of wood, and that is called bitterbrush. It was he and other incarcerees would go out and harvest it from the desert, and then it was probably all scraggly and full of bark that needed to be peeled off, and it needed to be sanded and refined and shaped. But many of the incarcerees found joy and pleasure in these natural forms that needed a lot of loving care to be made into something beautiful. But Dad used some. You can see a little piece of it on the shelf behind him in his workshop, and Gentaro is focusing very intently on trying to clean out the bark from that piece of bitter brush. These are some of the early pieces that my father designed. When he was first in Seattle, he did use dimensioned lumber, and he had just come from architectural school. The reason he went into furniture is that he did a survey trip of the West Coast, and he found, after having been in the Far East, in Japan and in India, where craftsmanship is very important, he says American architectural construction had nothing to do with craftsmanship. He was disgusted by the way they built buildings. They just hammered 2x4s together with nails, and then they'd put on some kind of facade so it looked nice, but he said it was all just, it wasn't real architecture. You know, he'd been in Japan where joinery is really important, and in India where the construction was really important. And there was a story when he was working on Golconde that the material, that the wood he was using for making the concrete forms didn't stay flat when they poured the concrete in it. And so he asked the mother of the ashram to get him some better wood, and she said, well, why don't you use teak, which sounds pretty extravagant, but they were able to reuse the formwork over and over again, so that it paid off in the long run. But he was very, very strict about the tolerance of the concrete. The people he was working with didn't care if it was accurate or not, but Dad was really very meticulous about the tolerance of the concrete pouring, and he was also that way with his furniture making. So these are two examples of the early designs. The first one was a revival. I found this old notebook of drawings. When did I find that? Long after my father was gone. And I thought, well, these are really interesting. I think we should put them back into production. So the one on the left is taken from those early drawings from 1941. The table on the lower right corner, it was actually made by my father after we came east, but I'm sure it was designed when he was in Seattle. When gosh, you know, I keep redoing these PowerPoints and leave things out every time that I don't mean to leave out, but we were extremely fortunate that Antonin Raymond, my father's boss from Tokyo, had left Japan and had to come a circuitous route because he couldn't come back to the US directly from Japan. They went by way of South America and Europe, but finally came back to the East Coast and bought a farm in Pennsylvania. And my father's professor at MIT contacted the Raymonds and said, could you please sponsor the Nakashimas so they can leave camp? If you had a sponsor on the East Coast, they figured that, you know, the sponsor would keep you out of trouble, and you wouldn't collaborate with the Japanese on the other side of the Pacific. Nobody did anyway, but Dad was allowed to do chicken farming. He wasn't allowed to do architectural projects, but he did come east, and we did settle in New Hope because of the Raymond sponsorship. We're very grateful for that. Raymond also knew Hans Knoll, and the people in the left-hand picture are the early team of the Knoll Studio. They decided they would have a team of designers to make furniture for them, and they would manufacture it, and therefore the furniture would be you know, a step above most ordinary furniture. And so in that period of time, Dad met Isamu Noguchi, he met Harry Bertoya, he met Hans Knoll, of course, and they became lifelong friends. I think also Buckminster Fuller was in there somewhere. So, and then after the war, Dad found a little cottage on Aquitaine Road, and this is outside the cottage. There were people from the WRA, the War Relocation Authority, who wanted to take pictures of us because they wanted to, it was good PR to tell people that the incarceration did us no harm. We were doing fine on the East Coast. And so they took pictures. Mom dressed me up in this little white dress, and Dad put a hammer in my hand, and they posed me for this picture. But that was in our new house on Aquitaine Road. And during that period of time, he developed this chair on the left, the grass-seated chair, and it was originally commissioned by René Darnaucourt, who was the head of MoMA in New York at the time. Dad had made him a table, and then he says, well, it's a nice table, but can I have some chairs too? And Dad realized who he was and thought, well, if I make him a chair, it's got to be something really special. And he struggled and struggled and struggled. When we had the Modernist Moment show here, I was allowed access to the file full of letters between Darnaucourt and my father in the 1940s. And Darnaucourt asked, is my chair ready yet? And Dad kept saying, no, it's not quite ready. I haven't figured out how to do something. And he finally figured out how to steam bend backs successfully. And I think the very first chairs my mother wove out of package twine. And I think that model is still in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. But anyway, so this was the chair that Dad designed for René Darnaucourt in 1947. And he kept trying to discontinue it because he thought it had a dated look. And for years, he kept saying, I don't want to make that chair anymore. And he kept trying to discontinue it, and people kept ordering them. And the funny thing is now that's our best-selling chair. And we've had to, we've had to make a lot of frames and backs, and we have to use a different, for a while after the package twine, we used Hong Kong grass, which was hand twisted and made in Hong Kong, and we used that for years, and that now it's deteriorated. It breaks all the time, so we can't use it. We use Danish cord now, which looks a little different, but it's the same weaving method, same design chair. And then there was this chair that Dad called the straight back chair. And a version of this was made by Knoll Studios. They still make it. I mean, if you want an inexpensive Nakashima design chair, you can get one from Knoll Studios. And it's this very same design, which my father originated in the 1940s. This is called the Mira chair. The very first one is there in the left-hand portion of the picture. And it was designed, obviously, for me in 1951. And we still make a lot of those, too. And this is called the long chair. In the 1940s, 1950s, a lot of furniture designers made chaise-longue kind of chairs for relaxing in. And Charlotte Perignon, I'm always curious whether Charlotte actually met, she was working with Le Corbusier in Paris, and she also was in Tokyo about the same time when my father was there. And I don't know if they met, but there are a lot of designs which they designed probably independent of each other, which are similar. But this is my father's long chair from 1951. It comes up occasionally on the secondary market, and we had discontinued it at the shop because it's a lot of work and takes a lot of time to make. And we didn't think anybody really had time to sit down in a chair like that and relax anymore. But a lot of people have been asking them, so we still make them and put them back into production. This is our Conoid studio. Dad started out in our little place on Aquitaine, which was down the road from where his cottage was. And he didn't have money to buy any property, but he found this south-facing slope and thought he wanted to build on that. And so he found the owner of the property, who happened to be an MIT graduate, and worked out a deal with him. He said, if I can have 3 acres to build on, I'll work them off on your farm. This is in the old days when you could do things like that. So he got 3 acres, started building the shop because he knew he had to earn a living in a workshop. And Mother and Dad and I lived in a tent on a part of the property. And then after he got the shop fairly well built, he's built the house, and we moved into the house. And then he kept on building. There's about 15 buildings on the property now. I didn't put them all in this slideshow, but he left architecture to make furniture because he thought furniture was the same as architecture, only smaller, and he could control the process from beginning to end. And in the beginning, I think it was more expensive to buy the straight edge lumber than to buy the cutoffs from the lumber industry. So he started out with all the freeform cutoffs from the lumber industry, and decided they were beautiful, and he would bridge the cracks with knots with butterflies. And he said people didn't understand what he was doing in the beginning, but after a while he said they paid extra for the knots and the cracks and the butterflies. So this is another chair, which the one on the left was called the new chair. It came after the straight back chair in 1956, sorry. And we still call it the new chair. Obviously, it's not new anymore, but we still call it the new chair. The Konoe chair was designed in 1960 and named in honor of that Konoe Studio, whose picture I just showed you. And it was pretty radical in its time. There were people who were making tubular metal chairs and things like that. But there was a furniture designer who wrote this article and said Nakashima's crazy. He's making a two-legged wooden chair. He says, you better take it off the market. It'll never stand. And people will be suing you up and down because they've gotten hurt by sitting on this and the chair breaks. Well, it's our best-selling chair. And we've had much less breakage with this chair than we have with our four-legged chairs. So as time went on, he was able to acquire large slabs of wood and to supervise the milling of them. This is one of the larger slabs that he was able to acquire. And this was designed and built around 1963. He named this also after the Konoe Studio, but it was largely developed because he had access to the wood with his great big crotches on it. And the crotch end serves as an end table, whereas the narrower part of it would be a sitting area. This bench is actually from the Rockefellers, and it was in my dad's show called The Full Circle, which I think was in here at the Silverman Pavilion in 1989. And I forget what it sold for. It sold at auction in Europe for something ridiculously high, something like $500,000 or something. It was crazy. Partially because it belonged to the Rockefellers. This is a picture from 1966. My dad went to, he had been purchasing through a lumber broker in Philadelphia named Thompson. And Thompson introduced him to Mallinses, who had this big log yard in London. So that's my mother and my brother in 1966. They went and Dad selected these logs from Mallinson, and back then you could ship them over and have them milled over here. Nowadays you have to have them not only milled, but kill dried and certified bug-free before you can bring them in. But back then they let you bring the logs with all their bugs and everything else in. And this is at Mallinson's log yard. Most of these are English walnut or English oak burl logs, and my dad was just so happy to be able to purchase them and to bring them back. He said, oh, the Queen of England didn't know what she was doing. She should have sold her crown jewels and kept those logs, but I got them. So that was his pride and joy from 1966. We still have a little bit of that lumber around here and there, which we use very sparingly. But Dad just was so thrilled to get those logs. We never, and you can't get them anymore. We have a little bit left, but they don't export them anymore. There isn't any wood anymore. I don't know, but can't get them anymore. This is the one picture I have of a standing tree before it was cut down and made into lumber. This is from the Duke of Northumberland's forest, and that little yellow measure there, I think, is a meter, so you can see how big the log is. And then the next picture is that same log on the carriage at the sawmill. So it's pretty exciting when you take a log and you position it on a sawmill, and it has these really scary looking claws that are metal, and they put them on the log and hold them into place, and then run them through the mill. But it's amazing when you slice off the first few slices of wood from that log. You see inside of a log, which nobody's ever seen before, and you never know. I mean, sometimes, this one turned out to be amazingly beautiful. It was burled all the way through, but sometimes you end up with disappointments. I found I don't remember how I got it, but I had an English walnut log, and it had the root end on, which is very rare. Nobody really wants to take the time to dig out the roots from under the ground when you're harvesting a tree. And I thought it was going to be wonderful. I would get some wonderful root green like my father had, and we put it on the carriage like this and went through it. The whole thing fell apart. It was very disappointing. So you never quite know what you're going to get. A good logger will have a good idea, but you never know for sure what's going to be inside of a log when you put it on the carriage. It's pretty exciting. This is our pole barn. It's not a literal Pennsylvania pole barn anymore. It started off that way, but the fellows in the shop said, it'd be really nice to be able to use a forklift, which we got, and it's on the left-hand portion of the photograph. But he said you have to have steel beams in order for the forklift to function properly. So we have steel beams and a concrete floor, but we still call it the pole barn. But this is where the majority of our wood is stored. When my father passed away in 1990, there was this huge pile of wood that my father had milled, and it was air drying down in Philadelphia. And the Thompson mahogany people had been extremely generous to us. They befriended my father in the 1940s and allowed him to store his there's another story which I tell you about Thompson mahogany. Dad went down to the lumber yard and asked Mr. Thompson if he had East India laurel or rosewood, and Thompson looked at him and said, we don't sell that. It's much too expensive. And he looked at my father and his beat up overalls and thought, how is this guy going to be able to afford to buy expensive wood like that? And then he was curious. So there was a lumber broker from London who was visiting. He was taking him out for lunch, and he decided to take that out too. For some reason, he befriended my father. Thank goodness he befriended my father. He says, well, no, we imported some European burls to make veneer out of, and some of them aren't good enough to make veneer. They've got too many curves and cracks and holes. And would you like to have them? And Dad said, yeah. So I think the first batch, he didn't know what to do with them because the veneer people had rejected them. So I think he gave them to Dad, and Dad said, well, I would like to go down and mill them through and through. And people didn't do that back then. So, but he said, okay, you can do that. And so Dad went down and spent all day at the lumber mill milling these logs through and through. That means, if you look at the end of a log, you slice it straight all the way through, and then you end up with free edges on the outside, which nobody did back in the 40s. And anyway, this lumber came up from the sawmill in Virginia on railroad cars, and it came into the yard in Philadelphia, and the yard foreman looked at this pile of stuff, and he went up and, Mr. Thompson, somebody sent you 3 carloads of junk. I have no idea why they would do such a thing. Don't pay for it. And Mr. Thompson said very calmly, I have a client for that. And the foreman thought he had lost his mind, but he stood by my father all of those years. as soon as my dad passed in 1990, he said, it wasn't the same person, it was generations later, but they said, get this lumber out of here. It's taking up too much space. You know, they're used to straight edge lumber that you can move with machines, and it would move quite quickly, so they could make money. And Dad's lumber was taking up all kinds of space, dropping bark, and they wanted to get rid of it. I had nowhere to put it, so my daughter was working with me at the time. She's also an architect, and so she went with me to the zoning people and convinced them it was a temporary structure and be okay to build. So that was in 1990. And the little pile of burls up there on the right is, some of the wood we use, some of them are big, some of them are little. And then we use hand tools, and we still draw with pencil and paper. And our most important tool is the steel tape, as you see on the bottom right-hand corner of that picture. And chalk. We write on the boards with chalk directly on the boards. So this is a picture of my lovely husband several years ago, shaving spindles, a very important part of making our chairs. We still shave the spindles by hand. It's kind of like a nod to Japanese carpentry. Most people don't bother with shaving things with a hand plane anymore, but we still do that. The parts are made in batches, and those are some of the parts in the bins in the chair department, and there's a finished kono chair on the right. This is a picture of our associates in Japan. When I graduated from college in 1963 and went on a tour of a Zen Buddhist tour with Alan Watts. I don't know if any of you know who he is. He was an expert on Zen Buddhism. And then I studied Japanese very intensely for a number of months before I went to college. And my dad came to visit me in 1964 and made friends with this people called the Minguren. And they were an offshoot of the Mingei movement in the 20th century Japan. And they were in Shikoku, one of the southern islands of Japan, and they were part of a group that was trying to preserve the old Japanese craft traditions and adapt them to modern life. So Dad, they got along really well. Dad basically thought like Soetsu Yanagi did. He was the founder of the Mingei movement, and they did also, and they were really interested and skilled at craftsmanship, and Dad just loved them. He was like a duck. He was just really happy and at home working with them in Japan. And he did about 8 shows with them, and this must be, after they were working on one show, he's sitting on a bench that they made together. And they're still collaborators and good friends, and we're very grateful to have that connection with them. He designed several kinds of furniture. These happen to be English oak burl tables, but he named them Minguren. These are the Minguren 1 tables that he designed for a show in Japan, and I think these were the 2 of the tables that were in the Full Circle show that traveled in 1989 before my dad passed. Very simple construction, but it shows off the beauty of the wood itself. And this is a cabinet which is named the Odakyu cabinet because the shows Dad did, I think we have done like 10 or 12 shows in Japan by now. I haven't done any recently. We're hoping to do one again this year. But the Odakyu department store would sponsor our shows. And in Japan, the department stores aren't just to sell stuff. Most of the big department stores in Japan have a gallery space on the top floor, and they use it for changing exhibits. So Dad would have several shows in Japan. He was so happy because they treated him really well. They fed him really well and took care of him, and every single show was sold out on opening night. So, but one of the things he did was to take the Japanese grill work, which is very, very difficult. I don't know if some of you are woodworkers. know how intricate and complicated it would be to make a grill like this on those doors. And they're normally used in architectural places like they call Ramma. They're usually over a door sill. But Dad decided they would be good to use in furniture, so he took. We still make these. We get the grill work made in Japan and sent over, and we make the cabinets for these. And this is another phase of my father's design, which was done for, I told you about Junzo Yoshimura, one of his friends from the Raymond office in 1934, was commissioned to do a so-called Japanese house in Pocantico Hills for Governor Rockefeller. And Rockefeller wanted him to do the furniture as well. And then Junzo said, why don't you have my friend George do the furniture? So that ended up being probably the largest commission we've ever done for any one client. And these are the ottomans that he designed for the Rockefellers. Now, my parents went to Japan to pick out these beautiful Mingei covers that were antique, based on a traditional Japanese design. And the Rockefellers said, oh, it didn't go with their Chinese art collection. So we got the Rockefeller rejects. This is a project which my dad did in 1985 for the Museum of Modern Art. And it was in the Japanese wing. It had its own room when it was first installed, and now it's changed position. But a lot of people will go in and say, oh, I want a table just like that. And this happens to be figured English walnut, and of course there aren't any other planks just like that. But people will, that was, we also just came out with another book, which I should have, maybe we should bring some over here sometime. Yeah, but we should bring them, so if people are interested, they could buy them in your bookstore if you're interested. I had a design assistant a few years ago and said, it's really confusing. We had photographs. The very first catalogs that my dad had done were completely just hand drawings. And then people would order and they'd be happy with what they got. And then as time went on, we had photographs and we put them in the catalog. And it's very deceptive having photographs, especially color photographs, because they're of a specific project. And people will point to that and say, oh, I want one just like that. And there is never one just like that. They're all different. So we now have a process book that's focused more on how we do things and why we do things the way they are. And there are sketches again. The hardest part of making that book was trying to do the sketches for things that my dad didn't have sketches of, and they're put alongside my dad's beautiful sketches. That was really hard. But there are just pencil drawings and the description of how we work, and I think it's good. People know what we go through to make things. This is, I guess you could call it a transitional piece. It was part of the Full Circle show, which traveled around, but I worked on it because Dad refused to make detachable bases. He thought they should be an integral part of the design, and if they couldn't move it or fit it in the door, it was their problem. But this table is about 8 feet in diameter, and it had to travel. So I worked on it and made a base for it that was detachable from the top. And so there's a story behind this table too. We had friends named the Krosnicks, Arthur and Evelyn Krosnick, and they had started in the 50s ordering furniture for their office. He was a physician, and then they had a house in Yardley, and then they moved to Princeton, and they moved all of it. They wanted to make sure that their new house fit every piece of furniture that they had. And then their house in Princeton, Dad wanted to borrow several of their pieces for his show, the Full Circle, and they said, oh no, we can't live without them. And this table was still in process, so they said, okay, you can borrow that one. And then there was one other piece that they loaned to the Full Circle show. And then they had this house fire and everything in their house burned to the ground. And so the moral of that story is if a museum wants to borrow your piece, don't say no. So this is the one piece that one of the two pieces that survived the fire. It's a redwood burl. And this you have certainly seen before. The Michener Museum asked me to furnish or to do some kind of monument to my father when he passed away in 1990, and offered me this space. So I thought I would make a little seating of a special table and some chairs. And my mother and my brother said, "Oh, no, you can't do that. Dad wrote on that piece of wood, not for sale." And I said, "Well, it's not for sale. It's for Dad." So I got away with it. It's a Clara walnut burl, which my father was very, very fond of. He didn't want to part with it. And then the rest of the show is just some of the pieces that I've designed after my father passed. Things keep going and growing, and I'll show you some of our woodworkers at the end too. This was done for a special client in Hong Kong who said he wanted a tatami platform for his sleeping platform, and he wanted a solid vertical headboard, so that's what we did for him. The one on the left, I think there's one here, isn't there? I think there's one just like this. This may be the one that's here, actually. I designed for a client in 1992. His name was Professor Simon. I forget his first name, but he said he didn't want a regular rectangular angled base. He wanted a circular base. And I said, "Well, you really want a rocking table?" And anyway, I came up with this, and he was happy with that. So that's the Simon table. The reflection bench was made out of the Esherick poplar tree. Horton Esherick had he didn't have it, he was gone by then, but there was a poplar tree growing next to his studio that was dying, and they had to take it down, and they made it into lumber. And I don't know if you're aware, but a lot of woodworkers in the area were given pieces of poplar and asked to make something out of it for a fundraiser, basically. So that was my Esherick poplar bench from 2012. This is a desk I made out of a Clara walnut root for a show at Perry Rubenstein's gallery in New York in 2009. And then this Tenafly table has a history. It was standing in Tenafly, New Jersey, right next to an elementary school, and the children who went to school there played around it and loved it, but it was dying and leaning on the schoolhouse, so they had to take it down, and then they decided to mill it into lumber and make it into something. So these were the pieces of Tenafly lumber that I got. It was beautiful. It was ash, but it was figured ash, and it was quite beautiful. And this was a dining table I made in 2014. I think it was 18 feet long by 5.5 feet wide or something. And maybe I overbuilt the base a little bit, but I was afraid that, the bases that my father had designed were either too big and clumsy or not strong enough to support the table. So I made this, and the gallery that owned it was called the Sunset Setting, so I named it the Sunset Dining Table. And if you look at it from the end, it sort of looks like the rays of the sun. And they're a group of chamber players. Maybe some of you are aware of them, the Concordia Chamber Players. They're good friends of mine. I think they've had their group now for over 25 years. But they used to perform at the high school in New Hope, and they had some really ugly chairs on stage once. And I thought, maybe you'd like to have some Nakashima chairs next time? And they said, sure. So I loaned them Nakashima chairs, and they said, they don't work for us. Our chairs are scooped and they're slanted back, and the back is, positioned so that you can relax in it. They don't relax. They wanted a flat seat, and they didn't want anything in the way of their bowing and moving around and playing with each other. So I designed the Concordia chair. That's why I have one of these here too, but it was first designed in 2003. And this is a music stand. It's an English walnut root. My father first designed it around 1976, and we're still making these. Everybody picks out their own piece of wood, so they're all different. And we don't make too many of them, but it's fun. It's more it's you know it's this tension between being something that's cultural and artistic and something that's practical. It's it's obviously not as movable as a metal stand, but it works. I have one. Dad gave me one when we were married. And this is one of my last pieces I designed for a show at the Modern Gallery. The Modern Gallery also has been very kind to me. Um, I must say that when the Nakashima room was designed, Linda Milanese, the PR person at the time, was extremely kind. She said, I don't want you to go out of business. I want people to know who you are. And she gave me more public. I was so, I, Dad told me how to make furniture. He told me how to, to saw lumber. And I thought I had it made, but he didn't tell me how to get publicity. So thank goodness to Linda Milanese from the Michener Museum. She got me publicity and people realized that we were still alive and kicking. So I thank you for that. But anyway, the Modern Gallery was also very kind to me. Bob A. Bell is the proprietor there, and he'd been selling Nakashima as used furniture since the 1980s. And he continued to have Nakashima shows, and he named a lot of his shows after my father died as, I forget what it is, some of his titles were, but something about the Nakashima continues or something like that. One of those was K-Show, which was continuation. And he encouraged me to do things differently than my dad did. He says, oh yeah, you gotta, you gotta do something different so people realize you're not just reproducing what was done before. So he was, and he also taught me how to write PR and send photographs and different publications and get publicity. So I'm very grateful to him. This is one of the later shows that we did. And I had these crazy burls. This is a root from a maple tree in Oregon. And I don't remember why I bought them or how they got into the lumber sheds. And I thought, what am I going to do with those? And Miriam Carpenter, who's also been here, was my assistant at the time. So, we figured out different things to do with these maple burls. Now I wish I had more of them. They're all gone. But that was fun. We had this at the Modern Gallery in Philadelphia when he had a big window facing the street. So you could see this crazy burl, standing in the window from the street and walk in, and then on the other side of this burl there is a seating area. So we call it the tsuitate sofa. Tsuitate means standing plank, basically, and they use it in Japanese architecture as a movable spatial divider. So we do things called tsuitate for different reasons. Are obviously all different because the wood is all different. And this is our crew a couple of years ago, and my brother was still with us. But we were getting the man. Well, my brother's in the wheelchair in the front, and then there's a young woman. There's two women behind him, but the one on the right is Alyssa Francis, who's still working with us, and then to her right is Jerry Everett, and he decided he would retire after working at Nakashima's for 50 years. And John Lutz is on the far right. He's our manager. Some of the people have come and gone, and there's Toshi there and his mother, Sumi. So this is basically our crew. It's the most recent photograph I have. And that's who keep Nakashima's going. And we're very grateful to all of them. So these are our brand new machines. We finally got new machines. We've been using the same machines since 1957. And they were getting a little unpredictable, so we finally got new machines to replace them, and everybody's very happy. Now we have to upgrade our dust collector because there's more dust than there used to be. And Toshi's been making a lot of dust this week. So that's what we're up to. I want to show you some pictures of our peace altars. This was the very first one. that Dad built in 1986 that went to the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City. It's still there. This is the one that we made and that went to India in 2000. Oh, well, it went in 1996 initially, and then we rededicated it again in 2014. And again, you will see Toshi as a very younger Toshi, and his father and mother, and there's some other people that we went on a tour, and John is in the background too. We went on a tour of India with our Peace Foundation. Hope we will be able to do that again. It was wonderful. And this is the one that is now in Moscow. I hope it's doing some work there. It was dedicated at the 50th anniversary of the United Nations. Now, Dad thought of these peace tables or peace altars, and the first idea was that it would be an altar for peace, that people could gather around it, people of all nations, of all faiths, and that they would gather together and be able to work out their differences, and they could pray together or put flowers on it or sing around it or pray around it or whatever. But there should be people from all different faiths and nations that gather around one place on each continent. He said if that were to happen on a regular basis, we would probably be not as prone to war as we are. So that was his ideal. This is as close as we've gotten to it. This is in the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in 1995, but this is the way he hoped that the world would be someday. And, anyway, so that's the end of the show. And if anybody has questions, I would be happy to try to answer them. Thank you, Laura.
Since we are live streaming, I don't know. I have a microphone now too. I don't know why I'm doing that. You stay there, Mira. You stay there. Okay. I have a microphone, so if you have a question, please raise your hand, and I'll bring it over so people streaming in from the internet can also hear.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I have become a much richer person as a result of hearing of your history and that of your father. And today is my second day in a row that I get to speak with a Nakashima. So yesterday at my Rotary meeting, I actually said, I am going to hear Miss Mira Nakashima lecture tomorrow. Has anyone heard of the great craftsman and artisan George Nakashima? And someone at my table raised his hands like, we're distant relatives. So his name is Doug Nakashima. And in 5 minutes before we had to start our official Rotary meeting, he told me a whole story about the Nakashimas and the war in 16th century in Japan. So I know a little bit about your clan. So,
You probably know more than I do.
I found it quite interesting. But my question today to you is the peace altar. You said earlier that you are thinking or looking for a fourth location.
Yes.
What are considerations when you want to choose a site for the new peace altar to be installed? What do you consider as a condition?
Well, my father had this idea because this humongous log came to him, and he wanted to use it to the highest potential that he could think of, and that was what he thought of. And if we do use the planks of that size, they are about 10.5 by 10.5 feet. So it has to be a pretty big space to accommodate it. But the other problem is that it has to be, and this may be the biggest problem, it has to be a receiving group, an institution who is very much interested in peace. Our committee put together a series of requirements. If you would like to leave me your name and email address, I can send it to you. But basically it has to be a fairly large space, but also it has to be a group of like-minded people who will use it. The one in Oroville, and I think each venue is going to have a slightly different flavor. The one in Oroville is built at a lower height. I don't know if you noticed that, but it's used in the City of Peace for the Hall of Peace. And it's used as the center of an international community for meeting, but they also do meditations around it, and that was as a perfect usage. The one in Russia is at the Academy of Art. It's also must be non-denominational. When I first visited Russia after my father passed, looking for a place to put the altar, it turned out that the name for altar doesn't translate well into Russian, and that's where the name peace table came about, because the name altar means a specific size in a specific place in a specific religion. And Dad wanted to be available to people of all religions and all faiths. So that's one requirement. But I think that's most of it, and it has to be big, and it has to, has to be used for the right purpose. Thank you, though. Look forward to talking to you.
I studied woodworking with somebody who had a philosophy about machines. This was somebody who had sort of, I'd call a disciple of James Krenoff, and he felt like if it could be done with a hand plane, if it could be done with a brace and bit, that was the way he taught and preferred it to be done. Does your studio have any sort of philosophical point of view about when to use machines and when to work by hand?
There isn't any particular philosophy. My father realized in order to make a living, he could not do everything by hand, that he would have to use machines, and he used machines from the very beginning. We don't want to go to everything being made on a CNC, and we do assemble all the chairs by hand, and all the finish joinery is done by hand, but it's rough cut on machines. And it's basically the spirit with which one uses the material, which is important. And as I say, Dad realized he couldn't earn a living if he did everything by hand. So that was the main criteria. We do have our spindles and leg stock. We cut them at the shop, and we take the seat blanks from our own stock and glue them up and shape them and send them out to a factory that does have a CNC, and we send our models out to them so that it's done the way they are, have always been done, but it's much faster and less expensive to do it that way, and that's the only way we can keep going. So that's, but the way we work is that when a client asks for an order of something of a certain size or shape that has to go in a particular space, we have a design team that will work with them. And during the COVID shutdown, we would pick out pieces of wood and send them pictures, and then send them to sketches, and we did everything remotely. Nowadays, people will come in and look at their wood themselves, and there's an impactful experience of actually meeting your piece of wood. I mean, some people, I remember years ago, this man came in, and he had worked with my dad before me, and he said, "I want to fall in love with a piece of wood." And he came in and he fell in love with a piece of wood, and it was great. And that's hard to do by remotely. But so it's a combination of tools. In 1997, I did a series of very large tables for Michael Gavellini, and we finally got a thickness sander because we couldn't afford to do the project otherwise. But I think that's the latest, besides these new machines that are like our old machines, only better. We don't do our shop is pretty small. We don't have room for any more machines. Good question, though. Yes? The idea was that we would make 6 peace altars out of the same tree. Actually, there are 2 logs now that came in about the same time and about the same size. So we can make 3 more if we find the right place.
This is really, sorry, this question really originated with her, but she wants me to ask, do you ever see any of your pieces or your father's pieces on Antiques Roadshow?
Yes, I think a lot of them come up on Antiques Roadshow, and we also have a lot of inquiries for authentications in our office. Some of the pieces on Antique Roadshow aren't actually Nakashima's, and sometimes they come up on auction, and it's hard to tell if they're real or not. If we can't find the history, our friend Bobby Bell says if we can't find any paperwork, we can't really authenticate them. And it's really hard by photographs. You almost have to see them in person. Just this past week, he called me and he says, oh, there's this 2 cushion chairs at Christie's I was going to buy, but we can't find the right paperwork. And they say they were made in 1960. And he says, I don't think they made them back in 1960. And I said, well, I know the man who used to make those chairs. You should talk to him. And he's been retired for years. So he called him. He said, oh, yeah. He says, he told him about details on the backs of the chairs that were authentic and that he made all of those chairs for, I don't know, 20 years or something. So he knew how they were made, and he told him. And, he said he went to look at them and said, oh, yeah, when you look at them close, they look different. So it's tough. Sometimes it's very difficult to tell. There's also a piece at Rago's right now, which is in contention because Ezra Stoller, the photographer, was my dad's wonderful photographer. He did a photographic essay of every single building that my father built. And I'm sure my father probably couldn't afford to pay him, so we gave him furniture in exchange for the photographs. And Erica, his daughter, and I remember there was a dining table that we used to eat at all the time, and I was sure it was from Dad. Anyway, the table is at auction, and people say it doesn't look like Nakashima, it can't be Nakashima, and there's no paperwork on it. But Erica and I remember, so is that real or not real? I don't know. Tough, but it's fun. Every now and then we'll find something hidden.
Thank you so much for sharing today. I'm just curious, where do you find all the trees and the burls? Do people call you, or do you find them? And do they have to be dying before you cut them down? I'm just curious.
Yes, we are a member of the Sustainable Lumber Association, or whatever it's called. That has, I think from the very beginning, has always harvested sustainably. And we have one logger who lives in Doylestown, I think now, and he sells lumber in Danborough, but he was the apprentice to my dad's logger. Dad's logger used to go. He was a little eccentric. I interviewed him before he passed away because he was so interesting. He said he used to go all over the East Coast and find these big walnut trees, and then find out who owned them. And then he would convince them they didn't need them anymore. Then he would take them down and bring them to Dad. But the current logger was his, and he's the one who found the peace altar log in Long Island. And the fellow in Doylestown who's still working in wood was his assistant. He said he was I don't know if you watch people take down trees, it's pretty scary. But he was the climber. He would go to the top and take down the branches before they got to the trunk. But now he doesn't do that. Somebody younger does. But he has his feelers out for any trees that need to come down in the area. And usually if we go to look at logs at his lumber yard before we cut them into lumber, he'll say, oh yeah, I remember that one, that was in this terrible place and we had to do all kinds of machine work in order to get the tree down without hurting anything. And so it's pretty much local and it's pretty much sustainable. We do have some lumber which came from California. We have another logger in California who will get Claro walnut and redwood burl for us. And then we still have some of that lumber from Europe. There is also one beautiful pile of Persian walnut, which my father purchased in the 1970s, which an architect had ordered, and then he didn't like it, and then the lumber broker didn't know what to do with it, so they sold it to my dad, and he was just delighted. There was this beautiful Persian walnut lumber that nobody wanted, and we're still working off that pile. But most of what we have is domestic, and most of it is trees that nobody wants anymore in the area.
Thank you so much, Mira. That was really wonderful.
Thank you, Laura.